Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Strategoy guide. Today we're diving into Sylvaneth. It's been an army I've loved for a while now, and the new rules have got me really excited. Of course, there will be more to talk about when the new Battle Tome comes out, so we'll be making more guides for the Sylvaneth and even updating this one. If you're interested in more strategic content like this, please do subscribe and join our Discord for any further discussions. And let us know in the comments what your favorite Sylvaneth units are. We'll use that information for further content as well. But let's kick off this series with perhaps the most crucial part of the Sylvaneth Battle Tome, their mechanics for Overgrown terrain and Awakened Wyldwoods. In this video, we'll go over the crucial rules first. Then we'll look at placement of Wyldwoods and Overgrown terrain. Thirdly, I've animated several scenarios to show you how to make the most of our new rules. And finally, we'll quickly look at some units that we already know to be synergetic with those new mechanics. Before we kick off with the allegiance abilities though, I'd like to point out that they often mention Awakened Wyldwoods and Overgrown terrain together. We'll be using a new term for that in this video that bundles the two together. We've chosen to honor the Monty Python and went with shrubbery. So when we're talking about shrubbery, we're referring to the combination of Overgrown terrain and Awakened Wyldwoods. The first rule we've seen in the preview article is the Places of Power rule. After territories are determined and before faction terrain features are set up, you can pick up to 3 terrain features on a battlefield that are wholly outside of your territory. They are considered to be overgrown. At the start of your hero phase, you can heal 1 wound to each friendly Sylvaneth unit that is wholly within 9 inches of any shrubbery. So that means wholly within 9 inches of any woods or overgrown terrain. This rule sets up the rest of the video. Overgrown terrain will be hugely important when piloting a Sylvaneth force, and having the small heal on top of that is always nice. Being wholly within 9 inches is going to be a very crucial distance for us, so keep that in mind when playing. We'll look at what terrain pieces are best to select as overgrown terrain in a later part of this video. With Walk the Hidden Paths, things get interesting. Once per turn, at the end of your movement phase, pick 1 Sylvaneth unit wholly within 9 inches of any shrubbery. Set that unit up again more than 9 inches away from enemies and wholly within 9 inches of a different shrubbery that is more than 3 inches away from enemy units. Basically, it's a teleport. Veteran Sylvaneth players will be well acquainted with this mechanic, though there have been some minor changes. You can now only teleport to a wood or overgrown terrain feature, aka shrubbery, that hasn't got any enemy units within 3 inches. That means that an experienced opponent will be trying to move his troops close to shrubbery that he doesn't want you to teleport to. This rule is still going to be very impactful on all of your battles. And the next rule is even more amazing. Strike and Fate is almost exactly the same thing as Walk the Hidden Paths, but instead of teleporting in the movement phase, we're allowed to teleport in the combat phase, after fighting. Once per turn in your combat phase, after a Sylvaneth unit wholly within 9 inches of any shrubbery has fought, you can remove that unit and set it up again, wholly within 9 inches of different shrubbery that is more than 3 inches away from enemy units. If you've ever played Eldar in 40k, you already know how amazing it feels to deal damage and then just leg it. With this rule, this will be a core mechanic for our tree-hugging elves. You charge in with a Glasshammer unit, fight and then teleport out. We'll focus on how to make the most of this rule later in the video. Lastly, I included the rules for setting up an Awakened Wyldwood. Just as with all faction terrain, you're allowed to bring 1 for free as per core rules. You need to set it up in your zone though, and it needs to be 3 inches away from objectives and other terrain. It's important to note that it doesn't necessarily need to consist of 3 pieces. If you're lacking space, for example, you're also allowed to set up 2 trees or even a single one as your Awakened Wyldwood. Placing Wyldwoods is extremely important. We'll look at how to do that best in our next slides. For placement of woods in overgrown terrain, we're using a generic tournament table setup. If you're playing the General's Handbook missions, you're aiming for about 8 terrain pieces or, as is the case here, 6 small terrain pieces and a big one. Most missions also have a deployment zone of 11 inches, though there are some outliers here. In certain cases, you get half the table or just a corner as your own territory, which will obviously impact the way you place your Awakened Wyldwood and your selection of overgrown terrain. For this video though, we'll go with the most common example, and that's the 11-inch territory. When choosing 3 terrain features to be overgrown, you want to look at your game plan and the missions first. Generally though, you want at least 1 piece in your opponent's zone for battle tactics and threatening of his backline. He'll have to leave a unit close to it, so to block you from teleporting there. The other 2 pieces should be close to melee zones. These are spaces on the board where you expect to fight in melee combat. Having overgrown terrain close to these zones will allow you to use your strike and fade rule to teleport out of combat after striking. When selecting your overgrown terrain though, also keep in mind what other pieces on the board can create shrubbery. Certain spells and abilities allow you to set up an extra wildwood, and Alarielle can make new overgrown terrain with her monstrous rampage, for example. I wouldn't be surprised if you're covering the entire board with your homegrown plants by the end of the battle. Alright, let's look at placing our faction terrain next. If you're not used to playing Sylvaneth or the mission, it's wise to set up your wildwood in the center of your zone. That way, you'll have enough space to maneuver around it. Remember that with our new teleport rules, we can teleport only to a shrubbery that is outside of 3 inches from enemies. So setting up your forced wildwood in a safe space can be a great idea. If you want to be bold though, you can also set it up so that it cuts off access for your opponent, since they'll have a hard time moving their troops through it. Depending on the matchup and your army, you might want to use a weighted flank for your games. This placement works especially well for fast army builds, ergo armies with Gossamet archers, teleporting tree lords, Alarielle, and so on. Place your wood on one side of the table and set up some bigger threats on the opposite side. An unwise opponent will try to mirror your big threats with his. When they do so, you can simply teleport to your wildwood on the other side of the table and leave their big threats with nothing to do for the turn or two. Just make sure you have a piece of overgrown terrain on the other side of the board or a way of summoning a new wildwood there so that you can teleport with certainty. If you want to be really conservative, you can also hide your woods in a corner. I would honestly not recommend this, as you're reducing the space you have left to teleport your models to. But with a deployment like this, it'll at least be challenging for your opponent to reach you, and you'll at least be sure that there's always a wood that's safe to teleport to. Now for the exciting part. Let's look at some combat scenarios. When using your Sylvaneth force to its full extent, you'll need to consider all the movement shenanigans you can pull off. With Walk the Hidden Paths, you can cover a lot of board space in one movement phase. For objective play, you want to set up your shrubbery close to objectives. That way, you'll be able to threaten objectives from the safety of your own territory. Having the option to just appear on an objective from a wildwood in your own deployment zone is a threat your opponent will have to keep in mind constantly. Add salt to injury by creating more shrubbery like wildwoods via spells and abilities. Walk the Hidden Paths also helps with board control. Make sure your overgrown terrain and your woods are spread out over the board, so that there is no place you can't reach. Use freshly summoned wildwoods to block your opponent from moving onto objectives. Also make sure you've got some shrubbery that is easy to reach and to fall back to. The last thing you want is to place your overgrown terrain or woods in a way where you can't easily reach them anymore. Big or central terrain pieces are therefore excellent choices for overgrown terrain. When you're teleporting to shrubbery that's outside of 3 inches, it's important to think about the next turn. Who's most likely to take that turn? If you're going to be next, consider teleporting to a wood that's within striking distance of the enemy. If you're not likely to go next and you want your glass hammer to be safe, it can be wise to teleport them further back. You can follow much of the same guidelines when you're playing around with the Strike and Fate rule, though there are some extra things to keep in mind. Since you're using Strike and Fate in the combat phase, after you've fought, it's most useful to do so with a big unit before it is hit back. So if you've got any glass hammer units in combat, strike first with those and then teleport them to safety. Preferably, you also only want one important unit in combat during your turn, so that you can avoid getting hit back altogether. Make sure you're wholly within 9 inches of shrubbery though, otherwise all your work has been for nothing. You should probably keep this in mind during your charge move as well. You can charge a unit and be outside of 9 inches by a little bit, as long as you can move your entire unit wholly within 9 inches during pile-in moves. Strike and Fate can also be used to reposition a unit through combat or to claim board space that has been freed up during the shooting phase. Imagine your opponent has left a gap for you to teleport to, and you want to claim an objective there. Instead of just going for that objective via walk the hidden paths, you can first make sure there's enough space for you to set up your mauls, for example by shooting. Then deal some damage by charging into a nearby unit, and finally teleport out and appear in the planned space. Your opponent will have to keep an eye on every inch of the board when playing against the Tree Elves. With a new battle tome on the horizon, there are sure to be a lot of units that synergize well with these mechanics. For this video, we've chosen 3 that are almost sure to interact well with the new shrubbery rules. First and foremost is Alarielle, whose war scroll has been leaked, so we're 100% guaranteed that she'll play a vital part in making the most of your Overgrown terrain rules. When you charge her in, you can use a new monstrous rampage that's on her war scroll. It's called the Burgeoning, and it allows you to turn a terrain feature within 3 inches into an Overgrown terrain feature. Just let that sink in for a bit. So you're charging her in, you use your monstrous rampage that cannot be blocked, deal impact hits, and fight with her. And then you can still teleport out through the terrain piece you just turned into an Overgrown terrain piece. That means that, as long as you're fighting close to terrain, Alarielle is never getting hit back in your turn, unless you chose for that to be the case. On top of that, she still has her Metamorphosis spell that can turn destroyed units into Wyldwoods. So the Goddess of Life is sure to play a huge role in benefiting from your new Allegiance abilities. Up next is the Lady of Vines, Alarielle's right-hand tree woman. What's cool about her is that she has the Verdian Crown ability. Sylvaneth units wholly within 6 inches of her are treated as being wholly within 6 inches of an Awakened Wyldwood. That means that Sylvaneth units fighting wholly within 6 inches of the Lady of Vines can teleport out through her with Strike and Fate. She can even do that herself. Keep in mind that most of the time you can only go from her to a different shrubbery and not the other way around, as you will likely not be wholly within 6 inches of her when teleporting to her. The last in the list of units interacting with shrubbery are the Tree Lord variants. We've already seen Durtu's War Scroll, so we know they've retained their ability to teleport through shrubbery, and it's very likely the other Tree Lord variants will retain that same rule. Durtu's Sword also gets an extra attack from being close to shrubbery. It's not hard to imagine that the other 2 Tree Lords will have other rules that interact with shrubbery, like the Tree Lord Ancient, who's summoning a Wyldwood for free. And that's it for our first Sylvaneth guide. There is much more to come, so if you're interested, please like and subscribe and even consider joining our Discord. Also let us know in the comments what you want to see next or what your favorite Sylvaneth unit is. And if you're aching for different content, do not be alarmed. We're still continuing our strategy guides on the Lumineth, but we're branching out, get it, branching, to the other elven factions as well. You can expect a review of the Daughters of Cain battle tome soon, and a guide on the Lumineth Catalar quickly after that. We hope to see you there. Cheers!